My guest today is Mrs. Deidre Robinson Powell. Deidre Robinson Powell is an English language arts teacher and reading specialist. Deidre is the author of Open Hands, Open Heart, the story of Biddy Mason. She has taught grades 4 through 8 for over 3 decades. Deidre Robinson Powell uses literature and composition to explore social justice with her students. Deidre Powell, how are you today?
I am well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for coming on the show. I'm glad you agreed to let me interview you. I've been watching you and following, what you've been doing for a long time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So let me ask you. You wrote a book on Biddy Mason. Exactly who is Biddy Mason?
Okay, well, Biddy Mason is let's see, where do we begin? Biddy Mason is, I would call her perhaps our first lady of Los Angeles. She is an icon of Los Angeles history, born enslaved in 1818, managed to achieve freedom from her master using the court system of Los Angeles, and goes on to become extremely wealthy.
That's interesting because of all of her accomplishments that she achieved. I had never heard of her until I met you and in your book. I mean, I've studied African American history for all my life. Well, how come I've never heard of Biddy Mason?
Well, honestly, you and me both. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles County. My parents spent a lot of time, particularly my mom, she was an educator, a lot of time focusing on Black history. And so you can imagine how excited but yet heartbroken I was when I was teaching fourth grade at St. John Christian School in Inglewood. And social studies, the focus for fourth grade is California missions, Father Sarah, forgive me people. And one day we turned the page and there she is in Biddy Mason's story in her 3-paragraph glory. The kids were shocked and excited. I was shocked and excited. The kids were, I've never heard of her before. And I was thinking, I've never heard of her before either, but you are 9 and I am not. That's a problem.
Right.
I've never heard of her before, but when I started researching her, I realized why. The people in Los Angeles that knew Biddy, knew her story best, were the people that were members of First AME, or the people that worked in downtown Los Angeles and walked by Biddy Mason Park, or perhaps people that saw, her headstone at, noticed her headstone at Evergreen Cemetery.
Right. So when you wrote it, who was your target audience? Was it for children? Was it for adults? Who did you have in mind when you wrote it?
When I wrote it, my primary audience was my fourth graders. So I taught fourth grade for 4 years. And when we first found the story, the kids had great questions. I wrote them all down, and I committed myself to the next time I teach this lesson, I'm going to be amazing. I'm going to know everything, and I'm going to go beyond the 3 paragraphs in the textbook.
Mm-hmm. So when you wrote it, what exactly did you want the kids to take away from reading the book and finding out about such a spectacular person?
Exactly that. I wanted them to realize, well, first and foremost, I wanted them to realize that history is basically made up of the stories of individuals. And at that point, I felt that the kids, what few stories they had read about enslaved people, either you were Harriet Tubman or you were Frederick Douglass, and pretty much your narrative in it, or maybe Sojourner Truth thrown in for good measure, but then, that would be their only take on slavery in the United States. But, you and I both know that that's not true, that the stories are varied, they're unique, they are geographical, depending on where you live,
Right.
was your existence. So I wanted them to get an idea that, her story was unique, and that she, was able to persevere, and that she was able to use the court system to do it.
So I'm sure that all educators at some point come across a figure like you did, someone who has been left out, hasn't had enough credit. or they come across something that they've learned that people should know, but they don't act on it or write a book. What was your inspiration for taking it to that next level?
Well, to be honest with you, out of curiosity, um, one summer I took a UCLA extension course on writing, publishing, and marketing a book. Now, children's books. Now, honestly, the goal wasn't to necessarily come out with a manuscript for a book, although I did. The goal really was to study the craft itself. I felt that if I focused on learning how, what goes into writing, that I could teach writing better. You know, English majors are not all programs teach you how to teach that. You know, and so I was looking to become better at that.
So were you able to make it a required reading for your class?
Actually, I did not. At the time that Biddy Mason was published, I had moved on. I had moved back to junior high, so I went back to teaching English with junior high students. However, the teachers that followed me in fourth grade, they very much so did. And so, they would make a big production out of it. Kids would, be excited to, and the teachers would use it as a class set. So they would and create it into a unit to study Biddy Mason. On my end, I never assigned it, but on my end, when I started teaching 8th grade and social studies, I used it to kind of frame, I guess, the way California entered as a state, as a free state, and why they had to enter as a free state. So I used it to lead up to teaching about the.
So overall, what was the response of the book? The students loved it. Did the teachers like it? What about the administration? Did it cause a problem trying to introduce a book that wasn't part of the normal curriculum?
Not for, and I can't speak for all schools. At my particular school, everyone took great pride in the fact that one of their teachers had written a book. They hosted a book signing party. They always talked about it. Suddenly, I was always introduced as the English teacher who is also an author. Great. They took great pride in it. And I guess, as I made my way around Southern California, I never encountered any school or any teacher that expressed that they received a pushback. So we were just trying to insert one book.
Right. Well, being a writer and being distributing your books is very difficult. It's a job in itself. Would you recommend that other educators try that?
My advice to other educators, or anyone for that matter, that asks me about the self-publishing route, and I'd be interested in hearing what your take on it is, because you do the same thing. I always tell them to at least, try to submit the query letters, try to submit their manuscript to major publishers, because as you and I both know, that's a job and a half, trying to market a book. But I also tell them that if people tell them no, that and if they can self-publish, because now it seems it's easier than when we started, it's far easier than when we started. But I tell them that it does take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It takes a lot of work, a lot of hustle, to see if they can get their book published and get that support. But if they can't, don't take no for an answer. If you can self-publish, do it, go for it. Your story needs to be told.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice, and I often tell people the same thing. So the title, in your title, you have open hands, and open heart. What exactly does that mean?
Okay, so Biddy Mason had a saying that apparently was passed down through her descendants, and the saying is, "If you hold your hand closed, nothing good can come in." Hand is blessed, for it gives in abundance, even as it receives.
Oh, that's pretty deep. That's a pretty deep a deep meaning there. So her story is a very powerful story, and it's a story about economics. It's a story about freedom, about the criminal justice system, about the regular court system. What do you think that, how does that relate to today? You know, we're having all these issues with social justice and economic power, but this lady was able to do this back in the 1800s. I mean, what does that say?
Actually, it says a lot because, look at it from her point of view. Here we have a woman who is trying to sue for her freedom through the courts, but she can't, thanks to the Civil Practice Act of 1850, she can't, in the court of law, testify.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to the judge, Judge Benjamin Hayes at that point, to determine whether he is just going to rule based on everything that he's heard or invite her into his chambers to testify. He decides to invite her into the chamber to testify. And he, as well as in newspapers at the time reported, she was so impressive in stating what had happened to them and her desire to be free.
Mm-hmm.
He took a very literal reading of the law and decided to grant them their freedom. Judge Hayes, I believe he was from the East Coast, and so, and probably an abolitionist of sorts. So, he had a compassion and empathy, that was able to help him come to that ruling. It wasn't that way, even though California was a free state, it wasn't that way for everyone, up north, right. Northern California, because of the gold rush and because
Mm-hmm.
of jealousy, economics, an entire community of Black people they had moved, they had to relocate.
Right. And that's
in Los Angeles, Biddy was able to persevere.
And that's so ironic because now we're talking now about how corrupt the justice system is, and how the whole system, the court system, is not geared to help us. But she was able to do it. She was not a runaway slave. She got her freedom through the courts. That just seems very ironic. Dealing with the things that we're talking about now with social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you wrote the book, I know there was no way you could foresee what was going to take place nowadays and how this book would be relevant to now. But just looking back on it, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, and to answer your previous question, you connect it to today, you have to realize that, we have laws, we have a lot of laws in existence. I think the problem is, and we see it especially with our current administration, when you put judges in position where they have not had the experience to be a judge, or perhaps not, in their interpretation of the law is not, it's more so their opinion versus, versus a strict adherence and an interpretation of the law. Of course, no crystal ball, could not foresee that we know where we are today. But, advocating, moving forward, for us, advocating that, that there are judges appointed who are qualified, that they have had diversity training, that they have, they come to the bench with experience and knowledge and with fairness in their heart.
When you wrote the book, then I'm sure there had to be there was a period of time before you actually decided, hey, I'm going to write this book, and then actually start writing it. What was that process? When did you, after you discovered Biddy Mason and read about her, when did you decide that you were going to write a book? And then how long did it take to actually start writing the book?
Okay, so let's go back to that summer that I was in that class from UCLA Extension. Mm-hmm. There were about 20 students in the class, and currently 19 of the 20 in the class all had a dream to write and publish a children's book, a fiction, a work of fiction. the last person in the circle that the teacher went around and said, you know, well, what's your story? What's your story? I had no story whatsoever, but I was curious about a woman that I had been researching for about 3 years and had oodles and oodles of notes. And she said that not every book, not every children's book has to be a work of fiction. And she thought that it was a fascinating story and go for it. So 6 weeks later, because every week it was, you know, we received our lessons, instruction from her, and then we would receive our instructions for what to do over the course of the next week. And the next week we would come and present in class what we had. So 6 weeks later, I had a manuscript. And, you know, I had a manuscript. Part of the course was to write query letters, to get it copyrighted. And I did all the things. But then, you know, the publishers that I sent my query letters to, you know, well, she's unknown. Oh, only people in Los Angeles would be interested in her story. Oh, it's not universal enough. And so I put by that time, it was time to start teaching. I said, oh, well, I put my manuscript in a drawer and said, okay, started my school year teaching. And, you know, for me at that point, that would have been the end of the story.
And what made you start the self-publishing process, and how skeptical was it going in there, and were you afraid when you started the whole process of self-publishing?
Okay, so manuscript is in a drawer. I go to an aerobics class, a step aerobics class. The instructor has on a t-shirt that says First AME Celebration and has a picture of Biddy Mason on the shirt. And I nearly fall off the step bench, mesmerized by the fact that, oh my goodness, he's wearing a shirt. It's a Biddy Mason shirt. I rush up at the end and I ask him about the shirt, and he's looking at me, and, you know, I've been a student in the class for a while, and he's looking and he's like, okay, what is it, this Catholic school teacher, how do you know about Biddy Mason? And so I explained to him about, you know, the manuscript that I had written, and he says, you know, can I read it? I'm like, oh, okay, sure. Make a copy, bring it to him to the next class. And then, you know, like a month goes by and he never even says, oh, I'm getting to it. He never said he read it. He never said he didn't read it. So of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, oh no, he's read it and he doesn't know how to tell me he doesn't like it. But a month passes and he comes up to me and he says, you know, I've been meaning to tell you, I really like your book. And I shared it with Chip Murray, the pastor of First AME, and he'd like to meet you.
Right.
So, you know, I went and met Pastor Murray, and he said, the church cannot financially support you, but if you can find a way to get your book published, we will support you and help you to sell copies.
Wow, that's great. Now, with everything going on with the social justice and the murder of George Floyd, did you ever think that something like this, an event like this, would affect educators in the way that educators are doing their job? I recently came across an article where it said that there was a student-led group in high schools that are trying to change the reading requirements and trying to get more diverse literature in the schools. Did you ever foresee something like that happening?
No, I never in a million years would foresee something like that, but I'm so happy that that young people are driving this narrative, because they are right. They are 100% plus correct that their narratives need to be diversified. They need to hear an abundance of voices based more than what their current canon is. You know, people don't realize that there is a way to keep the classics that are so revered in the curriculum and pair them with other voices. Don't, you know, we don't take the time to consider it, to think about it. It does take a lot of work, you know, to get it done, to accomplish it. But, you know, it's well worth it for students. Students need a well-rounded education. They need to hear from those voices.
Mhm. So this is a question that came to my mind that I'll throw out here. So it's okay to keep Huckleberry Finn in our libraries?
You know, the thing about, okay, as an English major and as an English teacher, I am so against censorship. So I have a twofold thing. Honestly, on the one hand, there's so many other things that they could read. I personally, in my classroom, I would choose not to teach Huckleberry Finn.
Mhm.
However, if Huckleberry Finn has to be a part of anyone's curriculum, then it needs to be paired with the essays of Toni Morrison, needs to be paired with an essay written by Ralph Ellison about it, needs to be paired with, there's actually a book that was recently published called Jim Huckleberry, where the author tells Jim's story. Jim the story because we don't hear his perspective. The biggest problem that I have with Huckleberry Finn is that we are seeing, we are seeing, and we have to rely on Huck's narrative to tell us how Jim feels. Jim's a grown man.
Right.
He,
Yeah,
he should have the voice and he should be able to tell us how he feels.
yeah, I had a problem with it. I had a problem with it when my son read it, but he didn't. He didn't. He thought I was making a big fuss out of nothing. But it bothered me, but it didn't bother him at all. And so I was just wondering, what your take on it was as an educator.
I do feel that it can be harmful, and especially times like this. I really believe that it would be harmful, and it would be disrespectful, and I guess very it would be just horrible for teachers now to just say, here, go read Huckleberry Finn. No context, no pairing, and no nothing. Just here, have a nice summer, read this, come back. I also think that it's horrendous given all that's transpired since the murder of George Floyd to read aloud, just without any restrictions, without any regard to how your students of color, especially your Black students, would feel about the N-word, as Huckleberry Finn has it,
Yeah.
over 220 times. But I find that kids that have, like your son, have a strong sense of identity. Your son probably didn't have a problem with reading it or hearing it because that's not how he has been raised to identify himself. And
Right.
that's a thing too. Kids that don't have that confidence and that strong sense of identity. Think about how wounded they are when encountering texts like that. When teachers aren't being, I guess, more intentional in how they go about teaching. Or I would even add To Kill a Mockingbird can be problematic because we don't, Tom Robinson, we read about him, we see him through the eyes of other characters, we see him through the eyes of, we don't get to know Tom's story from Tom's point of view. And I think that's what what kids are protesting. They want to hear from, they don't want to hear or read about characters from the point of view of the white narrator. They want to hear from first person, whoever it is that the story is being told, whether it's indigenous, Latino, African American. They want to hear from those voices. They want to learn from those voices, and I think that's fair.
Yeah, that sounds fair. Do you have any other books in the works?
I am always thinking. I'm always thinking. I'm always creating, but they sadly have not gotten away from my word processor. But I'm working on it. I fall down rabbit holes. I recently, to share with you, I am the family historian for my family, and I recently was able to find the plantation where one of the lines of my ancestors were enslaved. I had their names on on an 1870 census, and I always wondered why the father was, enumerated as being born in one state, the mother in another state, their children in yet another state, and they all end up in Texas. So I haven't done any publishing yet, but I hope to be able to come out with a string of things.
Okay,
One hit wonder.
yeah, that sounds great. That's great. I'll be looking for whatever you do. How can we find your book now, Biddy Mason? How can someone find it?
Well, if they come to my house, they can find it in my garage.
Okay.
I'll have to speak to you at another time on how you have continued to be able to market and sell your book. The state of California revoked my seller's license when I wasn't sending them enough tax dollars
Okay.
a dozen years ago. I call this summer 2020 the second Black History Month. This has been, suddenly I was able to go into the garage and start grabbing up copies of Biddy Mason. I have not gotten my domain up yet for my website, but as soon as I do, I'll let you know. If maybe you can let your audience know down the road.
Okay. And then lastly, what advice would you give? What advice would you give to an educator who wants to publish a book or who sees something, that they want out there and they want to do it themselves? What is your advice right now?
My advice to them is not to take no for an answer, to follow their heart. There's a lot of things. I've noticed with children's books, there's a lot of publishers who feel that they want to follow a trend, or they want it to be marketable in the sense of they're thinking of, what toy can we create? What can we sell? What can we make? What can we do? And they're getting away from what is a good story? What would kids love? I know that when I was working on Biddy Mason, the thing of, she should be smiling, or can you create dialogue? And I was like, well, that would be putting words in her mouth. There's no written diary that says that this is what she thought, and this is what she said, except for that quote, which is why I just go about telling her story. The first time that I read my manuscript to my last fourth grade class, that's what the kids, my little audience in front of me, that's what they told me. They said, I like that story. You didn't make up things about her.
Mm-hmm.
That's, but nonfiction sometimes, it goes off into a little bit of let's make it, interesting for kids, and then the kids just basically, they just want the story, they want the facts, they want the truth.
Okay, well, thank you.
I would tell them to go for it.
Just go for it.
Just go for it.
Well, that's great advice, and hopefully others will listen to it and follow suit. But I want to thank you for coming on my show, and it was great talking to you, and hopefully we can do this again.
I hope so. Well, that gives me inspiration to get another out there.
Hey, thanks.